Our studies in James end off with chapter 5, which is a focus on the comparison of those who are materially rich and those who are suffering. The entire book of James is very practical, and it has to do with warnings to the rich as well as warnings to those who have a sense of entitlement in the church. You will recall that in James chapter 2, James warns against the preferential treatment of certain folk in the church on the basis of their material wealth. Now, toward the end of the chapter, there are a number of exhortations, but the first is, of course, a negative one, which is to the rich that they should weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon them, James 5:1. We step back in this study and we look at the issue of worldliness as a conformity to a pattern of thinking. This is endorsed by Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, which exhorts us not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. We take a step back from the particular flavor of worldliness that James is focusing on, and we also look at 1 John chapter 2, which talks about worldliness in terms of the world, the flesh, and the devil. Worldliness is a pattern of thinking, and that pattern of thinking is something that we can easily ascribe to. Those in the church have ascribed to a particular pattern which is very prevalent today, particularly in urban areas and in ours, which is that those who are materially rich are favored. Not only that, but they have what Francis Schaeffer referred to as personal peace and affluence, or they have sought after that. This has spawned an entire group of concepts and ideas and practices which then harm those in the fellowship. The worldliness spreads not only in the community, but it also spreads in the person's life. The life is affected by it, down to the minutiae level, which is the way they treat others, the way they speak to others, the perception of their own importance, the way they assume certain positions in the church, etc., etc. This is what James is warning against. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Bearing in mind, there is also the exhortation against the theft that occurs when the rich who gain favor in the church secretly, back in the office or at home, do not pay their laborers. Then the response. Up till now, the study is just negative, focusing on the negative, and that's important. But the response is to re-engage with this form of worldliness, to establish a biblical pattern, and of course to support one another in the fellowship. And it encourages patience in suffering, because the Lord is coming, and looking forward to the advancing kingdom. Hold on lightly to the things of this world. Although they are not to be treated as evil in and of themselves, that would be a form of dualism and even a form of Gnosticism, which was a prevalent religion of the day, but to hold on lightly to those things, and yet to set the balance that we ought to establish a doctrine of Christian liberty, which is that we are to enjoy all things richly that God has provided for us, but to avoid dualism. That is, of course, the belief that material things are essentially in and of themselves evil, and spiritual things are in and of themselves good. Then we ought to avoid the other forms of worldliness, which include the postmodern true leaven, which infects thinking today, but we are to counter it with a postmillennial truth leaven, And that is a truth, Levin, that permeates not only the whole life, but the whole church, and in fact ultimately will permeate the entire world. The knowledge of the Lord shall cover the earth as the waters cover the sea. We do distinguish this eschatology from the two others, which is in effect premillennialism and amillennialism. We need to see life and this world in terms of the two kingdoms, the dying kingdom and the advancing kingdom. But we need to see that, as the Lord said, the kingdom of heaven is as leaven, which just permeates. We need to look at ways in which the gospel has been spread around the planet, ways in which Christianity has transformed life, and we need to push on with this. There are other practical suggestions or exhortations, should I say, like prayer, bringing back the backsliders, confessing sins to one another, and similar practices. That's just a brief taste of what this study will cover. We do look at it in depth, looking at cross-references and various writings, including C.S. Lewis, Douglas Wilson, Charles Haddon Spurgeon, and others.